What's your icebreaker?
Now you gotta think about it.
No pressure.
My favorite color is red.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
Why?
What is the emotional connection?
Okay, if we're really going there,
Yeah.
I like really bright colors.
Okay.
Like I think that's always been a thing for me.
Okay.
So I feel like red's like, just sufficiently bright. Like when you think of like a canonical red, it's like a bright one. Most of the other ones can be like.
I had a car.
Something.
My first car was bright red.
Okay.
It was like.
Did it go faster?
I think it made it go faster.
Yeah.
It made my insurance go up.
Yeah.
It was such a grandma car. Literally like a grandma gave it to me for
Grandmas
free.
do need speed, so that does make sense.
Anti-insurance.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
But yeah, this older woman gave it to me for free.
How'd that happen?
Because my first job was at a hardware store.
Okay.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah, and she
Yeah.
she would always come in
Uh-huh.
to the hardware store, and I would always like help her move. Like she would always get like mulch.
Yeah.
So
And
I
you
would
put it
always,
in that car?
Yeah, I would
Okay.
always throw bags in there, and she's like, She like saw me bike riding one day to
Uh-huh.
work, and she was like, "Do you have a car?" I was like, "No," because I was like 18,
Yeah.
and she was like, "Well, I'm getting a new car. Do you want this one?"
That's so
I was
cool.
I was
What?
like, okay. Yeah,
Dude!
it was crazy.
Wow.
I had it for like a year and a half.
Uh-huh.
And I crashed.
Oh no, okay.
I didn't know that.
Don't tell a hardware store lady. Oh, that's so cool, dude.
Yeah, it was wild.
Consider the ice broken. Well done.
Welcome back to A Light in the Dark. We have a great episode coming up for you. My name is Matt.
And I'm Keegan.
And this is our
I'm
guest.
Chris.
Yeah, this is our guest, Chris. To give some context, Chris was one of the first people we really got to get close with in San Francisco. I remember we had a dinner date. We all went out for dinner. We got sushi, and yeah, it was really cool how open you were about your testimony with us, and yeah, we were one of the first people, at least for me, to like really feel like how open the Christian community can be. So it was great. It was great talking to you. It was great meeting you. And also, this podcast most likely wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for Chris, because the mic he is using,
The hardware for the podcast would be
it-
happening.
he very kindly lended his personal microphone to us, so thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and I just want to add also, like, the context of the microphone coming into play was crazy, because we literally, the night before, were talking with Ethan, who you guys have seen in a prior episode, and we were talking about the podcast, and it was like, oh, we're really thinking about doing this, like, and then Matt and I went home, and we were like, yeah, what is, like, the one thing we need to, like, get this going? We have a camera, or we didn't have a camera, we had our phone, and it was like, oh, we could record with our phone. We were like, the one thing we need to buy is a mic. And literally the next day, I wake up, taking a shower, my phone's on the charger, I come back to my phone, and it's literally, yo, do you guys, how's the podcast coming along? Like, do you need a mic? And since that day, it was like literally an answered prayer.
Yeah.
We didn't even know. And it's like, God is so good. And so
That's really
very
cool.
blessed.
That's really cool. I feel like I very rarely like live through those kind of moments where it's like, oh yeah, this is like absolute like, crazy timing. But yeah, I remember I think I was like cleaning my room that day, and I was just like, okay, this is like doing nothing. And I thought of you guys, and I was like, oh, this could do something.
Yeah.
Like it just feels like like the, faith is a mustard seed. Like take like what like very tiny thing I have, and I'm like, well, technically I could put this to good use maybe if they want to use it. And it's just cool that like, yeah, God honors like the super tiny things too. Where like this is like, it's just a microphone, but now it's a story.
Let's go.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Chris, do you want to give a little introduction for yourself to the people who are watching?
Sure. I mean, what do we want to know? I'm an open book.
You know, your name, your age, what you do.
Sure.
How long you've been a Christian.
Yeah. Let me think. I'm 26 now. I've been a Christian, I guess, for like 12 years. I'm assuming we'll get there, but yeah, around 14 was like the time God was really working in me. It became more real than just like a random dude on a pulpit. And like, yeah, that was like my whole baptism decision, like putting him on the throne of my life. So that was 12 years ago. Very different person now.
So did you grow up in a Christian?
So yeah, family? I'm from Indianapolis, just north of Indianapolis, Indiana. And I think the Midwestern sort of culture as it relates to religion, like most people like our parents' generation would go to church habitually. Like sure. Most of my friends in high school were not Christian, but like their parents, I think there's this like very transactional like cultural element to going to church where it's like this is just like what you do and you don't necessarily, you're not like on the hook necessarily to process through everything. And like I also went to like basically a mega church, so it was like it just felt very transactional. But yeah, I mean I grew up going to church, but it was like I think my early memories were like, yeah, just like this is a weird exercise. Why am I like showing up to some room with like kids my age and we're just like singing songs and then like playing or whatever.
So you weren't like really a fan of the mega church?
Yeah, and I don't want this to be about like how we should do church, but I feel like it didn't necessarily like connect with me, and I think part of it too was like a lot of like my incubation as a Christian comes from like a very intellectual cultural standpoint where like knowing about God and like knowing what the Bible says about things is like the emphasis rather than like experience. At least how like I was brought up in it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, because like you said, I mean, however church connects to someone is the most important thing. But yeah, when there's a lot of hype around church, I can understand how that could be harder to really feel like a spiritual connection, because smaller churches obviously have more intimacy, and I feel like that in Christianity is one of the most important things. So.
Yeah, I think it's just important that like church helps you like meet other believers who are like living it out, like, and how they make their life decisions, and let that serve as an example. I was also 12, so I like, who knows, maybe they were doing a lot of stuff right that I just didn't notice, but it was really like for me just like a big lecture of like, you know, a couple thousand people, and then like the pastor did his thing, like, you know, the band got up and like we sang songs and then we went home. I was like, this is not, you know, if this is all that it is, I don't want it. So
okay, wow,
yeah, but I think and I don't want to jump ahead if there's more to explore there, but like I think what really like started to turn the gears, started to like basically led me to realize that it's like more than just like a transaction or like this weird ritual like for an hour on a Sunday. I had a friend in middle school who like went to a really tiny church, like 200 people, median age like 65. And he's like, yeah, bro, we like have youth group out of my house. Like, do you want to come? And I'm like, yeah, I go to your house already. Like, I love new people. Like, this is fine. And I think like, yeah, just the intimacy that created, I think was a little like a better incubator for me to like bounce ideas and like learn. But yeah, I think like, again, this was 12 years ago, but I would characterize a lot of like middle school and what like led me to like inner turmoil is like just trying to run my life by myself. I think like even as young as like 12, 13, like perfectionism and just like the I don't know, performance aspect of things, I think was like a huge thing that my community was built on, like very much like academically driven. And I like played that game. Like I was like perfect student. And so I think like, yeah, it's something about like that environment and just like, you know, without God, like I think we are, led to believe that we have to run everything ourselves. And so I think that like in me easily bred perfectionism. And so I think like wrestling with that inner turmoil, like something in like whatever the pastor was doing, you know, for like years and years was like, oh, like Jesus has a purpose and a plan for your life, right? I think that was like just like a tagline. And I'm like, okay, well, if my way sucks and is really stressful, like maybe Jesus's way is better. And then I think like, yeah, just like showing up more to like a consistent community was like, oh, okay, like these people are my age and they actually like read the Bible too. Maybe I should figure out what Jesus says. And yeah, I think like, yeah, it's hard to like think back 12 years and be like, what exactly did I understand?
Sure.
Like, what did I know about what I was getting myself into? But
Sure.
I think I know, like, you know, I was like handcrafted. I was like loved well, and I was like built to relate to the God of the universe. And I think like, yeah, at least those elements were in place when I was, I remember we had like, just like a regular youth group gathering, just like 15 people in a basement kind of thing.
That's
And
cool.
it was the first time I'd ever been exposed to like silence and solitude as a practice. Like we just like sat around, and I'm like, again, hyperactive perfectionist. I'm like, this is like a huge waste of time. What are we doing? I think, yeah, even today, I think I'm like still teasing out like, how do I deal with like boredom and how, like, why can't I sit still? But this is, yeah, like literally the first time like trying it, and it was the whole story of like Elijah is like hiding in a cave. And it like God's like, go away from me, and so he waits in this cave, and he's like, there's like a bunch of natural disasters or like crazy stuff. There's like a, I don't know, I don't want to misquote it, but I feel like there's like an earthquake or like a fire. And it's like, yeah, but the Lord was not in the earthquake and the Lord was not in the fire, right? And then like the Lord shows up in like this still small voice whisper kind of thing. And so it's like, oh yeah, we need silence because that like helps us hear God, and like thankfully that clicked.
Nice.
So I remember just like sitting on my couch, like it's like we had like a basement that nobody used, and so I just like sat on the couch down there. It was like super dark, and I'm like, I'm just gonna sit and like see what happens, and I would like make a regular like ritual out of that at like
That's awesome.
13, 14. And then like I think God really honored that and used that, like, and what I understood, you know, loved, like built for a purpose, like built for a relationship. And I'm like, okay, if I have these foundational blocks and I like see that working, like I think the next step is getting baptized. So
Can I ask, so when you would sit there, what would that look like? What was your experience?
yeah,
Was it just complete silence, or did you have thoughts coming?
I think I like, again, yeah, memory's crazy, but I feel like, yeah, it was just like, oh, if silent, then hear from God. Like that's like all I knew. And so I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna like try to sit here and like I think I was just like really hung up on like getting something audible. I'm like, oh, surely like the voice of God will descend upon me. It didn't, but I mean, I still like, I think like that thought of like, oh, baptism is like a next step in my like walk, like is not something I could have come up with on my own. And so I like had that thought, read it back, and I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. Like maybe that's God, I don't know, but I think this is like my next step.
Wow.
So yeah, that was super cool. And I feel like, yeah, I think there's a lot of hope in that. Like you don't have to get hardly anything right for God to work, you know?
For sure.
Like I was just sitting there trying to like hear him, you know? And I think, yeah, like that's the willingness that God saw.
I feel like that's a big thing for people, is people feel like prayer needs to be a big deal. You know what I mean? But like prayer is, like you said, it's just as simple as sitting down in a dark room and just trying. Like it doesn't, like you said, nothing happened, but you felt something drawing you to get baptized, and you don't have to, it doesn't have to be this huge moment for you to feel something in your spirit. So
Yeah,
That's really
it doesn't
cool.
have to be this crazy external thing.
Yeah, like I know.
But it can be. I think
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
like you also have to hold that expectation. Right?
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
But it's just there. I just feel like it's a lot more simple than a lot of people think.
Mm.
Like people think it has to be like this big thing, but
Yeah.
and it can be, like you said, which is
Mhm.
really cool.
Yeah.
So
I think that was like a big jetting off point for me. I was like, okay, like yeah, baptism is like a public profession of my faith. Like I'm doing this, you know,
Mhm.
barely know what it means, but like I'm like, I think I recognized at that point that like I was trying to live not for me, but like Christ was on like the throne of my life, right? So it's like, oh, there's this like authority structure, and like I am subordinating to Christ, and I think that's like, yeah, probably like enough, you know. I think that was like what I needed to know, and like I was obedient to that in that context. But yeah, I didn't really know how to do that. Like how do I live more for Jesus, right? Yeah, I mean, I think I did pretty standard youth group stuff. Like we'd go on retreats, like my pastors really invested in me. And I learned more and more about how to walk that out. I would characterize most of my like high school experience as like, yeah, just discovering like a life of worship. I'm a huge musician, so I was like playing music for like the church in a bunch of capacities, and like,
wow.
but yeah, to like lead worship is also like not musical hardly at all. Like it's like you need like musical abilities, but like you're trying to like craft an experience where like people can encounter God. So I feel like I basically spent 4 years like really learning how to do that, and I would like talk to a lot of my like Christian and non-Christian friends in high school and like try to engage them with stuff. I took a lot of them to church. I'd like run Bible studies out of like the band practice rooms and stuff.
That's so awesome.
So I think like with the tools and understanding that I had, like it was like a life, like my high school life, whatever, was like a time well lived for God. And yeah, I think, I think there was definitely like genuine fruit.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't wanna skim too far over it, but talking about relationships with Christians and non-Christians,
Mm-hmm.
what was how did you navigate that line with trying to stay faithful with the Lord, but then also like your high school age teenager trying to find yourself,
Yep.
while also trying to find God? And so what did that look like for you?
Totally. I think, I mean, I think we'll get there like in other chapters, but like I think looking back, I could have done better. But I think, yeah, I think the navigation is always both, right? Like I think, probably what I like gravitated towards and what I thought in high school, which I think differently now, is that like, oh, like, you know, but Jesus was at like parties all the time, and Jesus was like criticized for like hanging out with sinners. So like, why can't I just like go off on my own into like the world of sinners and like, you know, redeem all of that space? It's like, well, yeah, but I think like, you know, like Jesus is living sinlessly. And I feel like we as like imperfect people, like also have the responsibility to surround ourselves with people that can help hold us to our commitments. And so I think like I had that vaguely in like the youth group I was a part of, you know. I think like if things really started falling out of line, like I had people that could like help bring me back. But I don't think I understood community as like something that you like tend to, something that you like actively work on. It's like, oh, like I need to make sure that I have people who like reflect my values too, and that's like the crux of it. Like that's the priority, right? I forget where in scriptures, but there's a thing that's like, yeah, like do good for all people, but like especially the body of Christ, right? And I think like that's something I've learned definitely over the years, where it's like, yeah, like I want to engage the whole world in a Christ-like manner, but to do that better, like I need to be around people, or like share life with people who like reflect my values.
It's impressive that you were able to stay so consistent throughout high school? Because I feel like high school is where a lot of people
Yeah.
separate themselves.
For me, that was
Christianity.
college.
Okay, well.
We'll get there. But yeah, in high school, I think I had just enough to be some sort of like semi-vigilante.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not claiming to be perfect
Okay.
at all. I'm sure there were plenty of places where like, yeah, things were like not, working well in my heart, and I didn't have the right people like to notice and like help me like tend to that. But yeah, it didn't go completely off the rails, at least in high school.
That's good. So like, was there just something about like, you said you like worship music, you didn't really like feel like a connection to that? Is that what you were saying?
No, I think like high school is where I established my identity as a worshiper.
Okay.
And to lead worship, I guess, in a musical context, which is like what I was doing for the church. It's like involves music, but it's not about the music.
Okay, got you. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's
So
awesome.
it's like, yeah, how do you like, yeah, make everything you do like this worshipful sacrifice, but like also like when you're singing songs, like how do you do that?
Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah. So I think music is a whole nother thread in my life, and it was like very cool from like a early on perspective to be like, oh yeah, I used it like in the context of a church, and like this seed has been planted in me of like, everything I do musically is also like woven in and around like honoring God.
That's
So,
beautiful.
yeah.
And how old were you when you got onto the worship team at your?
Probably like 14, 15.
That's
I feel like
really
it was like
cool.
8th grade. Literally like nobody was doing it. Like
Wow.
for a while we just like didn't sing songs, and I was like, oh, my parents got me like this like $100 guitar. Can I like lead it? And my pastor's like, sure.
That's awesome.
So it started really clunky. Like it was like not a musical performance, but like you don't need that. So
as long as the spirit's there,
yeah,
that's
exactly.
all that matters.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And of course, like, attenuating your art, honors God in its own way. But to make it the whole picture is like missing a lot.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, as you talked a little bit about moving into college, what was, so you said you strayed away a little bit. How did, like, the start of college, what kind of led into that?
Totally. So I remember freshman year, like, you move into the dorms, and they're like, I think 99% of my life at that point had been spent in Carmel, Indiana. Like very like bubble, like upper middle class, like academic focus. And I think like going to Purdue, like a big state school, like you just meet people from like around the world with like tons of different experiences, right? So I feel like freshman year was like kind of the high school vigilanteism of like, oh, like you do your thing, but like I'm a Christian, I don't mess with that. And I think over a while, like, okay, one other contributing factor, I think there were just so many college ministries and so many churches around Purdue, which is a great thing. But I think I got into like a consumeristic or like a like theological sort of thing where it's like, oh, I need to like make sure I find a church that like, expressly believes like every single thing that I believe, and like the people are cool, and like, I don't know, it's just like the right fit for me, right? If there's like 20,000 pairs of jeans out there, like you would assume that like one of those cuts and one of those sizes and one of those fits is like yours, right? So I think I like started off with the right intentions. I was like, oh, first thing I want to do, plug into a church, right? And I like tried a couple different congregations, and I'm like, wow, there's like so many options. Like maybe I'm just picking the wrong one because like church isn't like working for me, which is like very consumeristic. Yeah, I mean, looking back now, I think like belonging to a body is like, yeah, a commitment that you make, and there's like a certain threshold of like, yeah, you guys like aren't like doing this thing that I believe to be true about like how God works, so like, from like a moral standpoint, I can't really like get involved with that. But like that aside, it's like, can you serve the body? Like we're like called to be a part of the body of Christ. It's like, if I could be a reasonable part in that body, like I think that's reason enough to like join the church.
Yeah, 100%. I think we found that out when we first came out here, and it was like, when we first experienced our church back in Maine, it was like this smaller church, very like intimate and just a great experience. But coming to SF, we first tried Reality, which is this like huge church, a lot of people. We were slipping in and out, didn't know anyone at first, and it was like, I don't know if we should be here. And it's just, it's really, it's encouraging to hear, especially like, because we ended up sticking it out, and it's just been a blessing for us. But it's like, the importance is it's not going to be the same experience, and so I think it's really cool to hear that you went through something similar.
Totally. Yeah, I think there's like definitely a discernment process, but I would totally nix the notion of like church shopping. Like there's no perfect body, just like there's no perfect person. So yeah, just like the litmus test for me is like, okay, where can I serve best? But missed that in college, right? So I feel like, yeah, end of sophomore year, like junior year kind of rolls around. And without a sufficient community to reflect my like commitments and values back at me, I think like it's easy to like slide towards like what feels normal. And like the normal people I was hanging around was like definitely into like the party culture.
So when you were like, so you, at this point you didn't have a church that you were going to regularly, and it was kind of, you were just hanging out with some people, and were you still practicing faith, or how did that look?
I think I still would identify as a Christian, but it was definitely looser, and I think practically speaking, like I was back on the throne. I think, yeah, like I think it was like my experience with God was largely reduced to like a mental exercise, where it's like, oh, like I know what the Bible says about this thing, and I know that like, you know, God exists, and like I can give you the right answer, so I'm doing church well enough, which like, yeah, could be like the Midwestern church culture that I grew up in. It's like, yeah, if I know the answers, then I'm like, you know, living right by God. Or like I think when you're like in sin, like it's like easier to convince yourself, like the rationalization doesn't make sense when you like say it out loud, but like mentally that's kind of like what you walk with, because it's like tiny steps in like the wrong direction. But yeah, I think like, yeah, basically like without a community to like reflect values back at me, I was like picking my own values and chasing like my own goals, which were mainly just like, I think like the recapitulation of the whole like academic excellence, like am I being a good student, am I like learning the right things. But what really crept up was just like female attention as like my vice, basically. So I think there's like plenty of reasons that like people party in college, but I think like the way I dated and the way I partied was like definitely chasing that. And like, yeah, just like my own interest of like, yeah, I want people to be like giving me attention. And like a very like, yeah, twisted notion of like performance.
So at this point, were you still like seeking God through like prayer or the Bible, or like were you doing those things, or were you just like really missing out on like the community? That's
a really interesting question. I'm not sure what kind of rituals I was really doing. I remember like I was an RA sophomore year, and there were a bunch of other like RAs that went to church, so they would like bring me every once in a while, and I'd like show up to their small group. But yeah, it was just different. I was like, yeah, I was like partied that weekend, and I was like, wow, I'm still like a little hungover, and I'm like at church. Like, what do I do with this? Yeah, so I think probably like the best way to characterize it would be like it was like mental ascent, like it was a mental exercise. Okay. But like, yeah, I think there were definitely like points where it's like, oh, like I know that like past Chris, or like what I understand to be true about like what God wants for me, like would be like in direct conflict with this. Like how do I like, at some point it's like harder to rationalize.
Was there any points where you're like, wow, like I am very straight away from God at the moment, or was that just like something that you didn't really realize was a thing?
I think so. One other thing that happens when you're like, yeah, trapped in sin, I think there's like a general numbness that kind of happens, and so I think like, yeah, there's just like such a gift in being able to like feel and like how do I say this? Like, fully experience like good things and bad things as they happen to you. Because I think like a lot of, like the last couple of years of college was like, I think I was like, just like internally divided and like was unable to like feel a lot of like good things or bad things.
Wow.
Like I look back at that, it's like, oh, a lot of it was just like apathy. So I think like, there were definitely places where it's like, oh, I'm like drunk right now. Like like this is not what God has for me. Or like, oh, I'm having sex right now. Like this is not God's design. And you hit those points and it's like, I think a lot of like how apathy works is that you just like become desensitized to that stuff. And it like, somehow seems okay.
I just want to say thank you for being so open with that, because I feel like that seems like it would be a tough subject, but I feel like that's a subject a lot of people could definitely relate to.
Totally. Yeah, I think like, particularly like alcohol and sex are like where culture and, alcohol isn't wrong. Misusing alcohol, right? It's like where culture clashes with Christianity the most. And so again, like when you get out of like a community that's able to like uphold you to like values that are different than everybody, like you slide back into the normal, and then it like, like those start to clash. And like you have to resolve it, or in my case, just like become really apathetic and like try not to think about it.
Wow. Was there like any point in college where you like kind of started to feel a resurgence of like, I need to get back in line?
Yeah. So I moved to Spain. I was like studying abroad my second semester junior year, and I remember the start of that like was scary. Like it's like, wow, I'm like living in a different language, like on the other side of the world. Like I think Midwestern people just like don't like to leave their like home state or hometown. So it's like, definitely jarring, and like learned a lot about like, independence and just like how cool it is to be like around the world. And
That's awesome.
but I think initially like it was like scary. I'm like, I don't even know how to find my feet. Like I'm like in one of the biggest cities that I've ever been in. Like Madrid is a lot bigger than West Lafayette. And so I found myself like on the train rides just like pulling open the Bible, and like I had like, my 1 year plan. I'm like, okay, like God, sure, I'm scared, like what are you gonna do about it? And I like, it was like a super special, like I feel like I had like a lot of appetite for what God had. And that lasted for a little while. I want to say like 2 to 3 months of like, okay, let me like actively think through this. But I think a similar problem, right? Like community like wasn't able to like uphold me to that. And I'm not like, again, like the problem, like I think sin is like your own problem. I'm not trying to like scapegoat this and be like, well, there weren't people around me, so I guess I had to. But I think like, where like when you are like individually weak, like community like around you like helps hold you accountable, and like just reminds you of like what you want to be doing.
Absolutely.
So I think a few months of that, and then like was back to kind of my old patterns. But like that was like a really like cool moment where it's like, oh, like like as soon as I feel like I'm out of control, like I still somehow remember that like, oh yeah, God is in control.
That's awesome.
And that was a really sweet time.
Yeah, that's beautiful too, because it's like even when we fall into backsliding and into our old habits, it's like God is constantly pursuing us, and like he's literally just waiting for you to turn your eyes to him. And that's so beautiful that, and even it sounds like it was an encouragement when you did turn your eyes to him. And
totally.
It's like just the prodigal son, like when you walk away, he's right there waiting for you to come back into his arms. And so it's beautiful to hear that. Like, and so I guess, okay, so you slide away in Spain. So what does that look like? How does that kind of continue?
Yeah, I think it's like pretty much the same cultural experience, just in another country. Like it's not different anywhere else in the world.
For sure.
And I think, again, like I think the hardest part is just like, yeah, like memory and numbness. Like even like looking back on it, it's like I really don't have a lot of like concrete details and experiences, because I think you like get caught up in like chasing something, and it's like, yeah, my values are all out of whack, and like, yeah, just kind of, yeah, a numbness that like doesn't lead to like crisp memory.
Yeah. What was your relationship with music like throughout college? Like, were you still creating? Like,
Yeah.
Was that, like, if you were creating, was that like a good outlet to like kind of feel God's spirit again, or?
Yeah, I think it's like a creation versus creator kind of thing, right? Like I think like music is a beautiful thing because God is in it, right? Anything is beautiful because God's in it, but I think we all like kind of gravitate towards certain kinds of beauty because, I don't know, it's just like clear to see like the God in it.
Of course.
But yeah, like I think, yeah, I still wrote some songs in college. I remember I did an internship in Ireland, and I like bought this like classical guitar, and I would just like sit in my kitchen after work and like play it. So I think, yeah, like there is a lot of beauty in music, but I think to like truly see all of it, like you have to do the work of like tying it back to God. So yeah, I wouldn't say too much of it was like music for God's sake. It was like music for music's sake.
That's still awesome.
Yeah.
You were able to find like that light.
Yeah, I mean that was definitely where I gravitated towards. I sang like probably every day of college.
Let's go.
Yeah, did way too much with
Did
it.
you do any like live shows in college?
We had like a cover band of like a bunch of engineers. We're called Jaywalk Avenue. I started an a cappella group, and we just did like pop covers and stuff, and then sang in the school's gospel choir.
That's awesome.
So it was like, yeah,
that's so
tons
awesome.
tons of music. But
how often were you singing with the gospel choir?
I was like 2 or 3 days a week.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
That's so cool. So
and I think like, yeah, God was there in that. Like it's like music about God. Like I feel like there's like connections to be made, but yeah, I think I look at it like differently now. Yeah.
That's awesome. So you said you were in Spain your junior year. You went to Ireland that same year? Or?
Yeah, that was the summer, and then I had one more semester when I got back.
So what was your senior year like? You were at Purdue?
Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, I think, yeah, continuing the pattern. I mean, like, outside of what was going on, I think spiritually, like, I think I was, like, also just, like, restless and done with school. Like, I got back and I was, like, not willing to focus. But, yeah, I think that, like, sets up well why I came to San Francisco in January of 2020. I think, yeah, at that point, like, I was chasing me, and I think the professional side of me was, like, happier, like, out on the West Coast in, like, a tech city instead of, like, in the Midwest, and, like, I love nature, like, I wanted to be out there, and I think it was, like, yeah, like, I think it's great, especially when, like, yeah, when people feel, like, called by God to, like, you know, the, like, broken city that can be San Francisco.
Yeah.
But that was not my experience. I was, like, definitely chasing work and, like, chasing nature and, like, just chasing, like, yeah, I guess some sort of dream. Like, yeah, I mean, it's funny that historically, like, San Francisco is just, like, you know, gold rush town, right? And I think, like, tech is kind of that today, where it's like people like place a lot of hope in technology and in like even in like working in technology, like the salary and like just the whole lifestyle. I was like, oh, this feels like secure and I'll learn something, like why not? But yeah, like it's all I feel like those are like the job and nature were like my big reasons moving out here.
Yeah, and you moved here literally right before the pandemic.
Yeah,
so
I got like a month in.
So yeah, that obviously changed a lot about the dynamic of this city. But I feel like I remember you saying you like really were able to like get into church when that happened, right?
I'm one of the few people that San Francisco has made more Christian. So yeah, I think basically how that story went, like, you know, I was here for a month. I made a ton of connections. I like went back to reality. So like, yeah, in my sophomore year, I like interned out here, and I was like curious about like what church looked like out in San Francisco. Like, I don't know. I wouldn't. Yeah, I'm not sure where I was at with God at that point, but I was at least like warm enough to it that I was like, okay, let me like try this church out. And like really loved the sermons, and I think it was like, yeah, like good stuff to think about. I remember like the whole like generosity prayer, and I was like, this is crazy. Like where am I? Like this is nuts. Like so like there's something in like, yeah, even just like godlike generosity that was like, okay, there's something very compelling here. I'll continue to come. So I like popped in and out over the summer, and then yeah, I got back to San Francisco, and I think yeah, just like the whole church shopping experience was like bad. So I'm like, I'm just gonna go back to reality, plug all the way in, and if I don't like it, I'm gonna plug all the way out.
Okay.
And I plugged all the way in. I got into like a community group. I was like meeting with them regularly, and the world shut down. And so I'm like, guess I'm not plugging out. But yeah, I think that community group was like super helpful. It was just crazy to see like people from like all walks of life, all around the world, like different in every way. Like we would not hang out if it were not for Christ, you know. Like it's not like naturally we're just like, yeah, we're buds. And I think like coming from like a very homogenous place in Indiana, I'm like, oh, like is Christianity just like this like, you know, thing that fits like only one archetype, and like this is just like how God works. So I think there's like a lot in that. But equally so, I think everybody I met like outside of that group, like just people who had like made it by the world standards, right? Like people running their own company and just like taking all sorts of like crazy nature trips and like you name it, they did it, right? And they're like more lost than I was. Like they're like, I have no idea which way north is. Like I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what I'm here for. I've like tried like every new age spirituality thing under the sun, you know, like, and these are like intellectual people, you know. It's like I totally like you're processing this in like a very similar way that I would, but you're getting nowhere. And I was like I think like the community and like just seeing the end result of like what I was chasing, I think really put me on the fence. And it's like, okay, am I going to be for the person of Jesus Christ or against him? And so that was like a huge, leaning in point. I remember at the time I was dating a girl, and we were like, all the same stuff from college, right? And there's a verse that I love out of the Bible where it just says like God chastens those he loves. And like chastens is like freaking, you know, old English. Like what the heck is that? But to chasten, right, is to like discipline. So like I think like love and discipline have this fun dance where it's like to receive good feedback, like constructive feedback is love. Like for sure, if you're like raising a kid or whatever, like you want them to do the right thing, so you like discipline them. Of course. Right? But it's also funny that like chasten, like to be chaste is like to not have sex, right? It's like your virginity and like integrity with your body. So like I feel like I hit that, and like that like really spoke to like when I like I guess remade some sort of decision for Christ, right? It's like, oh, I'm like in this relationship where I'm like actively like dishonoring my body and God. I need to stop. Like I think any like mental sort of stuff that was going on like after I'd moved out to the city was like turning a lot of gears and like changing my heart. But it's like I actually made a like, and especially during COVID, like it was like that was my social crew, right? Like my girlfriend and like all of like our collective friends. So like to sever that was like severing this like anchor that was like my social circle out here, and like like the relationship. And I was like, this is a terrible end direction. I don't want this. And like God doesn't want this, more importantly. So I think like that like was the most concrete act of obedience that I can point to and be like, okay, like I'm done living for myself. I've tried it. You know?
Let's go. Wow, that's amazing. So you cut off that friend group. did you start getting closer to like the reality people, or?
I mean, COVID was still happening, right? Like I have definitely some great friends from that chapter. But I feel like, yeah, it was also like I had to feel the strain of like, oh yeah, like, you know, my normal bubble that like I would hang out with is like not what I need.
Yeah.
So if my options are like see the bubble or like don't see anybody, I gotta pick don't see anybody sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. That's amazing, the obedience and the discipline you were showing. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in that season when you were not seeing anyone, did you see immense growth with the Lord in like your pursuit of him and in being obedient?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say I was a hermit, right? Like
Yeah.
I think there's
No, I
like
get-
different
yeah,
ways to
yeah.
engage with
There's still
people, but I think it was like, yeah, just the hard work of like recognizing that it's like none of these people are like leading me to where I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it was like a time of exploration. It was helpful in like reestablishing like rituals.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Like I think, yeah, I mean the whole Christian walk, right, is like all these like disciplines, and I feel like there's so many like people and sermons and podcasts that'll like tell you how to like discipline in like the perfect way, right? Am I praying right? Am I like Sabbathing right? Am I fasting right? It's like, I don't know. I think it just takes a lot of time to like build up those habits, and it's not like about the habits in itself, but yeah, I feel like that was a time where I'm like, okay, well, I don't really have a lot going on. I'm just kind of like in my room. So let me like try to like establish like good practices that are like that will support me as I like try to go closer to God.
Yeah, I feel like being isolated is not in the sense of like completely cutting everyone off. Being
Yeah.
isolated with the Lord is super important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, like when I was first saved, the same like very similar thing happened to me, and it was like, how am I gonna grow this, or how is this relationship gonna foster? And
Mm-hmm.
it seems like, regardless of the steps you take, like if it's prayer, if it's fasting, if it's
Yeah.
reading the Word, it's like that pursuit of God and like recognizing Him as your King and your Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So it's amazing to hear that you're kind of in that journey. So from that, what was kind of the next steps in your journey, and how did that kind of look?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways to grow. What's coming to mind is like I think the whole like, yeah, chasing of female attention. Like I had not given myself ample opportunity to understand that I was like, or like to be content with my singlehood. And so I think like, yeah, after I ended that relationship, like it was definitely like, yeah, like a more monastic approach to life, where it's like, okay, I want to make sure that I am fully content with like me and God. And like, yeah, setting up the right rituals and like getting around the right people and just like sharing life. I think another thing that's like harder in the like, especially the male space, is just like vulnerability. And I think like a lot of the performance, like the twisted performative aspect of like how I was living was like definitely harder to like be vulnerable consistently. So a large part of like, yeah, that chapter was just like, okay, how do I like, yeah, be like, give up the sense of like control over like where I'm at. And just be like, yeah, like this sucks, or this is great, or like, you know, God did this, and it's not like this thing that I'm like gripping really tightly, and like being open and able to share that with other people.
So when you gave up that like how did that work? Like when you gave up that like feeling, like did you feel yourself like starting to grow, or like?
I think the cool thing about yielding control is like very important. I think like vulnerability like definitely like breeds other vulnerability. Like I think if like just like two people talking to each other and like one person is like, oh yeah dude, like this is like actually what's on my mind, like I feel like that gives the other person space to be like, oh, this is like what's actually on my mind.
Okay.
And I think it was just cool to see like the multiplicative nature of like vulnerability. It's like, yeah, it's like, it's not necessarily like what the other person does. Like, it's not about, I think like vulnerability for me is not about like how I'm necessarily like supported or reciprocated out of the other person, but it's like really nice to like receive that and then to like let that usher in like more heart sharing.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, if we're able to give up like the notion of control, like I have to be like in control of like how I'm feeling or like where my life's going, like it's like a lot easier to just like offer up what's going on. Like in a very meta sense, like this entire story sharing, right? It's just like yeah, I recognize that to a large degree my story's not my own. And like God's doing something with it. I don't necessarily know. But yeah.
Yeah, so I guess just continuing on your journey, like I guess we're kind of near the end of COVID at this point.
Yep.
So getting back into the world, how does your experience coming out of COVID look like?
Yeah. Again, I think like, yeah, in building the scaffold, again, it was like contentment with my singlehood, trying to set up like good community around me, and like I think prioritizing Christian friends was like new for me. Where it's like, oh yeah, like I can be friends with like anybody. I don't have to pick and choose. But like, oh yeah, it's like your community is something that you cultivate. I think that's the word I was looking for earlier. So like actually setting up good boundaries. Yeah, I feel like my whole like appetite for reading also totally changed around here. I was just like reading tons of books and like trying to figure out like, wow, like this is like how, yeah, I did a lot on like prayer. It's like, okay, this is how prayer works. And like, yeah, trying to think of any other like key
How did
moments.
your prayer formula change? Like, what were you doing
Yeah.
before, and then what kind of made it?
I think a really key thing to praying well is like praying with expectation. I feel like a lot of my prayers before that point were like, oh God, if you don't mind, I would actually really like to be slightly more comfortable right now. Like, can you do that? Great, thank you. You know, and I feel like, yeah, the shift is like, God, I know like you can do like incredible, miraculous things, and I'm going to like believe you for that. Like I'm going to like, you know, this is what I'm trying to do, and like how I'm trying to like move in the world to honor you, and I like, you know, hope with like eager expectation that this thing happens, and like to pray for it in a way that like if that doesn't happen, I will be like thoroughly disappointed.
Wow.
But like when you pray the prayer of like, oh, like, yeah, just like make it more comfortable if it's your will, right? Like, I'm not trying to, you know, ruffle any feathers, right? You're like hedging yourself against disappointment constantly.
Okay. Wow.
And so I think like that alone, like, yeah, did a lot to change my prayer life.
Yeah, and I'm intrigued too because I'm thinking about like your upbringing of like this idea of cultural Christianity.
Yeah.
And how in your pursuit of God and in your pursuit of like reading specifically and learning about prayer, how that's shifted your prayer life.
Yeah.
And now you are like tangibly expecting God, and you're knowing God. It's not just this far out guy that is like created everything. It was like, all right, I'm out of here.
Totally.
But it's actually this God that is with you in the challenging moments and wants you to ask him for these things. That's
Yeah.
so beautiful.
And I think like God is not just this like perfect model and this like theoretical thing that it's like, oh, I know that a life well lived like meets these metrics because God says so, and now I know the right answers.
Yeah.
Like it's like God is also like uniquely and totally involved in our lives in a way that like we can go through our day like expecting to receive things from him.
Yeah.
And like if it doesn't feel like that happens, like you get disappointed. Like I've definitely been there. I remember just like a meeting with my mentor where it's like I feel like I've been like doing all the right things this week and like nothing's happening, like just like radio silence. And it's like, okay, like what do you do with that, you know? But
do you see that as like this is God's will for a reason, like he's doing this for a reason? Or
I think, yeah, I mean,
Like if
I
you
say
are
this, I'm not.
like if you pray and you are disappointed that something didn't happen.
Yeah, I think a lot of the times we're not going to know.
Mm.
And so it's like, yeah, sometimes like you just engage with like disciplines and like try to open yourself up to God, and like you just hope that like the spirit that you know to be true is like moving something around in there, you know? Like, yeah, I'll come away from like, oh wow, like I just like, you know, read like a whole book of the Bible, and it's like, what happened? Like 3 hours later, like you can't remember it,
It's
right?
true.
It's
True.
like, well, I guess, you know, in faith, I have to trust that, like, God did something in my heart there, and I'm, like, a better person for it. And, like, I will continue to, like, engage with these things and, like, open myself up to God, even if I can't viscerally feel it all the time.
That's awesome.
So, like, I think, yeah, in that specific instance, like, I think God was, like, preparing me and just, like, getting me used to the muscle of, like, seeking Him. But, like, I don't think most of the time you necessarily know what God's doing, but that's no reason to like stop. And that's no reason, like, yeah, I think responsible stewardship of prayer is like, yeah, feeling the full disappointment when it doesn't feel like it's working, and like feeling the full like gratitude of like, wow, like I did nothing to get myself here, like thank you God, you
For
know,
sure.
that I'm like up today. And like I think just tying it back to like the rest of my story, like I think yeah, like I think I'm trying to like actively cultivate gratitude right now. And it's just like, yeah, especially coming from like just such a like place of numbness, like the fact that I'm like acknowledging that God exists and like able to like feel sad that something isn't working out, or like feel happy that like I've been like gifted with this certain thing, like is like gratitude in and of itself.
Yeah.
Like it's like really everything is a gift. You know,
Yeah.
left to my own devices, like I will just sit there and like, you know, in a very like numb way pursue my own interests. So it's like anything that's like happening outside of that is like a gift from God.
Yeah, that's very well said. And so, okay, so you're back like in the world, and you're pursuing God. At the same time, you're working and doing music. How does the journey continue from there?
I'm not sure there's like another like focused crazy spiritual catalyst. Like I think a lot of the rest of the process is like, you know, like trying to establish these patterns of like opening myself up to God. Yeah, I think there was there was like a couple months where I met with a spiritual director. And I think that was pretty helpful of just like recognizing like, okay, how like what in my day like can I receive from God instead of like actively like doing myself. Like I think one thing that like surfaced and like I'm sure was around like for both of my positions was just like, yeah, this like obsession with like productivity. And I think that's, yeah, again, like the same barrier to vulnerability, like this like control of just like I want to be in control of my emotions and in control of my work and in control of all these things. So I think I felt for a while just this like whenever my productivity was threatened, I was like off, like this is just not working. So I think what I had to come to realize, in this period of like building my day out and building my structure so that I like, you know, am able to encounter more of God. I think, one thing was like just learning to receive. Be like, wow, like there are so many gifts that like I can't claim, like I can't be, you know, if things go well or poorly, like there's a lot I like can't claim to have done myself.
I think it's really cool to see your full circle, like going from school where you were so numb and you didn't really understand what you were doing was wrong, to getting to a point where you were able to realize the friends that you had weren't necessarily helping you grow. So the fact that you had the self-awareness to cut some of those people off is awesome. It's so awesome to see how God grew your spirit.
Yeah.
Strengthened your spirit. That's so great.
Yeah, and I think so much of it is just like cultivation. Like it's not like I can control every aspect of my life, but I like, yeah, see what's missing and try to like make sure that like the soil of my own heart is like ready.
Let's go.
Yeah, so it's this weird like active but also receptive posture.
Let's go.
Chris, first off, is there anything else that you want to like cover with your story? Is there anything else that you like? Is there something you felt like you haven't hit on?
Sure. I mean, I feel like just to round out, like bring us to the present day, like I think it's really cool to see like the redemption of like, yeah, just like how I pursued dating for so long. And then, yeah, just like meeting Janae after like, yeah, basically swearing off dating for a long time. And like watching that dating relationship grow, and then like getting engaged 2 weeks ago, and just like,
wow.
yeah, thanks.
That's awesome.
But yeah, I mean, I think like there's just such a gift in her, and like, you know, like it works both ways. But I think it's like really cool, like the redemption that like God is doing specifically in that area just through her.
Let's go.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So cool.
So we're stoked, but it's just cool to like look back and be like, wow, I was so far off from where I'm at now. And I feel like, yeah, that's the sign of a good testimony, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go.
We've had a lot of those on this podcast where like these full circle moments. So that's really cool that you got to have that. And of course, you'll always have those throughout your life, but that's cool that you have one even really recently. You know,
Yeah.
That's so cool. But is there anything that any final message that you want to say to anyone watching, like if this was the one thing you could tell people, what would you say?
I think, one thing that I've learned that I would hope other people can take with them is that we are grossly incapable of willing ourselves into the right thing. And I think it's, just a reliance on God that brings about the best stuff.
Man, that's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and like being vulnerable and willing to share. We know that this is going to bless someone, and your story is really relatable. Like there's a lot of moments that I can pick to that I think of my experience, and it's very similar, and I just know that it's going to touch someone's heart, and we're grateful to have you on.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for using my mic.
Thanks for loading it.